Good evening. I want to thank you for your patience, and I know this will be worth the slight delay. I'm Marilyn Cochran-Smith. On behalf of LSOE Dean Maureen Kenny, who is here somewhere, my colleague and partner in this project, Professor Dennis Shirley, and myself, I want to welcome you to the fourth event in our series on public education and the future of our democracy. This is a unique project in that it couples a graduate course on education and democracy, and the students are here at various tables, with a lecture series. And the whole thing is part of Boston College's year-and-a-half-long celebration of its sesquicentennial. I also want to note, please put this in your calendar, our next event in the series, it will feature John Rogers from the UCLA Graduate School of Education and Technology and its Institute for Democracy, Education, and Access, or IDEA. This will take place on March 19th at 4:30 in the Yawkey Center. Professor Rogers will speak on the topic, Something Bigger Than Myself, Youth Organizing and the Formation of Civic Identity. In just a moment, I'm going to have the pleasure of introducing Randi Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers. But first, I want to acknowledge some special guests who are here this evening, and I apologize if I leave anybody out unintentionally. Richard Stutman, president of the Boston Teachers Union, who is somewhere right here. Welcome. Tom Gosnell, president of AFT Massachusetts. And Celia Lowe's, Deputy Director of Communications at AFT, back in the back. Welcome. All of us who read the newspapers and pay attention to the media already know Randi Weingarten, who is president of the 1.5 million member American Federation of Teachers, which represents teachers and other school and educational personnel. She was elected to this office in July of 2008, after 11 years of service as an AFT vice president. In the months immediately following her election, she launched major efforts to place education reform and innovation high on the nation's agenda. She led the development of the AFT Innovation Fund, an initiative to support sustainable, innovative, and collaborative reform projects developed by members and their local unions to strengthen public schools. Prior to this, President Weingarten served for 12 years as president of the United Federation of Teachers, AFT Local 2, representing some 200,000 educators in the New York City public school system. For 10 years, she chaired New York City's Municipal Labor Committee, coordinating labor negotiations and bargaining for benefits on behalf of 365,000 members. A teacher of history at Clara Barton High School in Brooklyn's Crown Heights from 1991 to 97, Randi Weingarten helped her students win several state and national awards debating constitutional issues. Her commitment, and this is why we invited her, is to education reform and to improving schools, hospitals, and public institutions for children, families, and their communities. She's fought to ensure that teachers and school support personnel are treated with respect and dignity and have a voice in the education of their students. Randi Weingarten holds degrees from Cornell University's School of Industrial and Labor Relations and the Cardozo School of Law. Also, interestingly, early in her career, she worked as a Wall Street lawyer, and she is currently an active member of the Democratic National Committee and numerous professional civic and philanthropic organizations. Please join me in welcoming Randi Weingarten, who will speak this evening on the topic of teachers, public schools, and democracy. You want this? You have both.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, if I'm on my tiptoes, can you see me? But I bet you can't see me if I'm like this, right? Yes? No? You can? You know, I do wonder why podiums are always this big. But I do think I actually would need Dr. Hargrave's doctrinal students to be able to figure that out, because it is really above my pay grade. I am really delighted to be here, and thank you, Dr. Smith, and thank you, Professor Shirley, for actually saying you have to be here, you have to be here, you have to be here, you have to be here. I want to do a shout out to Dr. Hargrave's students who have helped us hugely with one of our proposals that we have made. And most importantly, yeah, you can clap for yourselves. Where's Dr. Hargrave's students? Come on. And most importantly, I want to thank all of you for being here. And hopefully, by the end, is it like in the middle? Is this March? I know it's February, but is it that it's just really cold? Is it that our planes were late, so we got here late? Is it just that it's like that hard, long slog before the end of the year? Like, tell me what it is, right? February. I know it's February, but it's almost March. And after March comes April, and after April comes May. And then you get to do everything that you want to do over the summer, correct? Kind of. And then you go and kind of try to figure out how to make sure that you can pay all of your college debts, right? Right? Now, let me just ask this. How many people in this audience actually want to become a school teacher? Fantastic. Would you just stand instead of just raise your hand? Come on, stand up and be recognized. Come on. Thank you. How many people are here because you hate unions? Thank you for being so honest. Tom and Richard, that's who we have to talk to afterwards. How many people are here because you say, or you're thinking, public education is important, but what the heck does a union president have to say about public education? No one? How many people are here because you think public education is really important? How many people are here because you're wondering, does the union movement have any relevancy still? Come on, be honest. How many people are here because you actually know someone, just one person, who has or was or has ever been or ever wanted to be a member of a union? Okay. So I am honored to be with all of you, and thank you for that little, mini poll here. And I'm honored to be with you, but I'm going to tell you one quick story first, because I do actually still get really nervous about doing these kind of speeches, particularly in the middle of a college. And I want to start by telling you about one of the most terrifying experiences that I've had in my life, and that was being a guest on the Colbert Report. I gotta laugh, finally. So, who watches Colbert? See? Who watches Jon Stewart? I see there are more Colbert watchers than Jon Stewart in this room. So, I put my stage fright aside because Colbert, in his really wickedly funny way, was dealing with the issue of why were all these governors in Wisconsin, Ohio, and everywhere else that seemed to be in the Middle West trying to strip public workers of any input or any rights or any voice they had in anything they did or anything they earned. I do have to tell you, I am a little, it gives me, I am very quizzical about the fact that these same governors and some of these people in these same states have, when it comes to gun issues, want to make sure that teachers have the latitude to carry guns in schools or are armed, but they don't want them to have the latitude to use their professional judgment in those same schools. But, these are the things I think about, just like why are podiums taller than people who are 5 foot tall. But Colbert called out the absurdity of these efforts with questions like, and I quote, "Why should union members get something good because they organized and fought for it if other people don't have it?" And another quote, he said, "I know that a rising tide raises all boats, but when the tide goes out, I want to make sure I drag you down with me. Shouldn't everybody live a terrible life?" Swear to you. Go YouTube it. So I hardly had to speak, thank God. But Colbert laid out how absurd and harmful these attacks were in a way that people heard it. But unfortunately, some comedians have a lot more common sense than some politicians. And the efforts to weaken unions, and with it, working families, has continued. And I start a speech on public education by talking about unions for a purpose. The 2 institutions in the United States of America that foster broad access to economic and educational opportunity, and I put those 2 together, the 2 institutions that do that are our system of public schools, and I would include higher education in there, and our labor movement. And at the time when both our public schools and our unions are under attack, I had a union that stands at the nexus of these 2 institutions, and I guess that's what we would call the luck of the Irish. But frankly, I wouldn't want it any other way, because these 2 institutions still, regardless of how tattered they get, are the gateway to the middle class, and they are the centerpieces of a just society and a vibrant democracy. And I talk about labor first because the one question I asked in kind of a funny way was whether anyone in this room ever knew anyone who was a member of a union, as opposed to asking it as, are you a member of a union? Are your parents members of unions? Are unions relevant in your life anymore? And most of the time I don't ask it that way anymore because for most people, people think, well, they were really, really good in the 1920s and the 30s. But why do we need them now? What are they relevant for? How many people feel that way? Honest. Thank you for being honest, even though everybody's like this. So why should you care about a labor movement? Most of you probably wouldn't even remotely think about being a member of a union. And as someone like me who started out as a lawyer, I actually never expected to be a union activist, much less a union leader. I thought courtrooms were the places that we fought for rights and for justice and for equitable treatment. I thought the days of being on the streets and fighting for that were over. But I would argue to you that we should all care about the state of America's union movement, whether we decide to be a member or not, or whether we think they're relevant or not at the moment, because unions are a key driver of voice and fairness and of equity and opportunity. Voice, fairness, equity, and opportunity. So, you think about unions, factories, probably, right? When you think about a union, you think about a factory. Yes? No? And industrial unions have a pretty proud history, fighting against wages that kept workers in poverty, fighting to prevent owners from locking workers inside factories where they could burn to death, as 146 people did in the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. but they play important roles today as well. The world today is really different. The world of work is really different. And the issues that we talk about these days is as different as the world of work is from the days of yesteryear to today. I was thinking this morning, I don't know if you read the New York Times online, after, of course, you read the Boston Globe, or with the paper. But front page, Yahoo, right? Now bringing people back to work as opposed to working at home. Totally going to change the nature of what's going on in Silicon Valley. And I was thinking about Yahoo. I was also thinking about classrooms because, classrooms, in some ways, like Silicon Valley, are really the equivalent of startups these days. We have to use the best R&D available, even though we may not be able to find it or afford it. We have to experiment and innovate to find better methods. We're abandoning even established practices when they're not working. But think about it this way, and this is probably the most important thing I'll say to you tonight. How many people in this economy, in this environment, with unemployment being as high as it is, with people who are over 50 years old, hard to get a job again? How many people would be willing to put their jobs on the line if their creativity, their risk-taking, their questioning of what somebody else is doing would actually cause them to get fired? You know what gives teachers the space to use their professional judgment? And it probably feels very cognitively dissonant when I'm about to say this. Collective bargaining and due process. Done well and done right, but collective bargaining and due process. Because in this age of breakneck innovations, we should be unleashing innovation. In this competitive global economy, our students have to be prepared to compete, not on the basis of test-taking skills, but on the ability to analyze and apply knowledge, something that you in this room do probably innately and instinctively. That's what we have to do with and for all kids. So to do that, how do we do that in this day and age? So we'd say that teachers have to be treated like professionals with tools they need to teach, time to ensure that all students are progressing, latitude to use their professional judgment, and the training and support to stay current and to continuously improve. And that's the kind of unionism we don't simply preach, but we practice. And I want to make this point again about tools because it is incredibly, I would say, shocking to me still that this is a constant struggle for teachers. Imagine if Tiger Woods didn't have golf clubs or surgeons didn't have instruments they needed in the operating room. It's not imaginable. Tiger Woods wouldn't put up with it, and there's no surgeon or doctor who would put up with it. But teachers often have to fight for the tools they need to help their students succeed. Take manageable class size, lab equipment, even enough novels, hardcover or softcover, so that every student in an English class could actually have a novel that he or she could read. Individuals on their own can't really fight for all those things every year in every class. And that's what a union does. Unions help create the largest middle class in the world, and they still provide one of the only ways to counter income inequality that is tearing the fabric of our democracy. Labor unions actualize important ideals such as freedom of association and opportunity for all, which our founding American fathers and mothers died for. Strong unions stand up against unchecked power, such as I talked about before, those governors who wanted to rule by fiat and didn't want to negotiate with the people who do the work. Strong unions make economic sense. I would actually argue that they're pretty conservative in a way. So, for example, imagine if Walmart was unionized. According to one analysis, Walmart employees today rely on $2.66 billion in governmental assistance every year in the form of food stamps, Medicaid, and other taxpayer-funded programs. If they had a living wage, they wouldn't be relying on these programs. And then there's the fundamental issues of fairness. The relationship between employers and employees is generally unequal. Generally, if you're an employee, you gotta listen to your boss, right? Generally, you don't have the same power as your boss. Workers on their own have a limited ability to improve their wages, their benefits, and other kinds of things. The only way they can do that is they do it together with other people. And frankly, that's what happened when we got the 40-hour work week, which doesn't feel like a 40-hour work week anymore. That's what happened when people started getting things like living wages and some health care and some retirement benefits. And the benefits won by union members spilled over to non-unionized workers and spurred the creation of America's middle class. This is what I mean. The rise and fall of the middle class and union membership are almost in total sync with each other. 30 years ago, when unions represented about 33% of workers in America, we had probably the halcyon days before the gas crisis of the middle class. In those 30 years, as unions went, wage inequality also rose by 40%. And these days, right now, the top 1% of this country, I'm not saying this because I want to be, in the Les Mis film and start, battening down the barricades. I'm saying this because this is what has happened in our country in terms of inequality. The top 1% owns about 42% of the financial wealth in this nation, while incredibly, everybody else owns about 2.3%. And in the last 2 years, the income of the wealthiest 1% in America rose by 11.2%. But for everyone else, wages decreased by 0.4. So all I am saying to you is that when you don't, in a macroeconomic way, have something, some entity that tries to do whatever it can to lift all boats, to raise wages of workers, to make sure there is, unlike what we have right now, some retirement security. I know it's the last thing that you're thinking about. But like me, many of you will end up becoming part of that sandwich generation where you're going to be taking care of your kids and taking care of your parents at the same time, because your parents won't have pensions anymore. So what the labor movement has done is we try to create a balance. We try to stop this inequality. We try to create equity. And that's why we try to grow. Because if you're only one union in a city and you've gotten your members $1 or $2 or a $5 wage increase, You think the employer next door wants you to be there to get that $5, $6, $7 wage increase? What do you think? If you're the only one there, the employer next door will say, wait, I actually can compete better. I actually can lower my prices in this store. And that store will go out of business because their prices are higher than the prices in my store. So when we are fewer and fewer people, we can't actually raise wages in a way that becomes a living wage. That's really different than years ago when we had the big plant in a community and that wages were raised in that big plant through some bargaining. And then all of a sudden, everybody else, because that was the big plant in the community, the boss said we're going to raise wages. The community said we're into that. The union helped raise those wages. And then what you started seeing is that the shopkeepers had people in their stores that were actually paying their bills. And people could buy homes. That's what I'm talking about. That's how the middle class got created in America, because constantly wages would go up in a very, very incremental but significant way. That's what created the middle class. And right now, unfortunately, as we see more and more layoffs, more and more recession, more and more foreclosures, we see a race to the bottom rather than a race to the top. But it's not simply about wages. It's about how you create a better quality workplace. And that's what I want to spend the rest of my time about. Because we use collective bargaining not just for wages and benefits. We use collective bargaining to do the things we need to do to help kids. Whether it's making sure that students have textbooks on their first day of school, or whether it's limiting, frankly, the number of PA announcements or interruptions during class time, or whether it's making sure, and this was a really, really silly one, but you've heard it before, so I'm going to use it, that teachers actually have time during the school day to actually go to the ladies' or the men's room. It's one of the things that if you look at some of the contracts, you see something that says, teachers will not teach in public schools more than 3 periods in a row. And the reason for that clause is because if kids are going from period to period to period and all you have is 3 minutes, how are you going to be able to do what you need to do? Silly, but those are the kinds of things we've had to negotiate. But in really, truly, what we really try to negotiate these days is how we use collective bargaining to think big, to pursue a quality agenda that's focused on how to use evidence, how to help all kids, how to, once you have something that really works, scale it up, and even more importantly, how to sustain it, to make sure you can keep on growing and ensuring quality over decades and decades and decades. And I'm glad that my colleagues from Boston and Massachusetts are here, because I have been blown away by one of the schools that I've seen in Boston, the Edwards Middle School. I said that right? Richard always tells me I have to actually put the in front of Edwards. So this school is in Charleston. It risked being closed several years ago. The school had struggled for years, and it had 4 principals in 5 years. But at one point or another, about 5 years ago, the teachers at Edwards said, we are not going to let this be the trajectory of our kids' lives or of our lives. They negotiated a longer school day so that they could use the extra learning time for tutoring and electives. Students don't wait to the end of the year for help. They get help just in time. But they also use the extra funding for things like art and music and drama, things that are absolutely part of every private school syllabus and curriculum. But more and more and more, kids who are poor never get access to. Test scores have actually soared since teachers took the lead to not only increase the school day and do just-in-time tutoring and deal with and create all of these electives, but what has also happened is that teachers have taken real leadership roles in the school. The school has gone from looking for kids so that it wouldn't close, being threatened with closure, to having waiting lists for kids to come to that school. We call it a school that parents would want to send their kids to and educators would want to work at. But the bottom line here was this school turned around because of teachers working with each other and working with the then new principal, who happens now to be the master in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And we said together, we're going to turn this around with a few resources that we get. And now, frankly, the school actually used an AFT Innovation Fund grant to put some of their curriculum that they had done online so that other teachers could use it. And it is online on 2 platforms, Better Lesson, as well as the platform that we created, Share My Lesson. So you can use collective bargaining not only to create better wages and to create community stability and to fight against inequity, but you can use collective bargaining to actually create a quality agenda. And that's why it's so important in terms of public education if one believes that public education is a gateway to a just society and a vibrant democracy. Now, do I think our schools are the best thing ever? No. Do we have more to do? Absolutely. But what's the fight that happens in the United States of America over public education? It's a fight of ideology over evidence, particularly in education policy. In some ways, just like in labor policy, people are trying to extinguish each other as opposed to following the evidence, as opposed to following voice and fairness, equity, and opportunity. Also, in America, we have a shamefully high child poverty rate, and we have an achievement gap that mirrors this economic gap. And mitigating these 2 things is really hard, tough work. Yet what I'm seeing more and more is that the reforms of the day are top-down, test-based, privately, focused on privatization, focused on school closures, competition, and firing rather than developing teachers. In some ways, the so-called reforms of today are premised more on competition and obeisance to privatization, sanctions and measurement, as opposed to what will actually really work to help all kids learn. And the dilemma has been that, particularly given austerity, which most of our school systems have had to deal with since the greatest recession, since the Great Depression, and this fight about sequester that's happening right now is just going to make it worse. And that's why you hear these kind of screams from the left and from the middle saying, get to an agreement, Congress, instead of another false manufactured crisis. What this has done has put so much pressure on public school systems throughout the country to teach to the test, to narrow the curriculum, and to reinforce the teaching of low-level skills, as opposed to what we need to do, which is how to help all kids apply knowledge and critically think, not just memorize. And what has happened nationally is that even though parents actually still love their local schools, if those local schools are still open, we have seen the highest level of demoralization in the teaching force in probably the last 25, 30, 40 years. Now, I said we have a lot of farther way to go, a lot more to do, but it is not true what the edu-entrepreneurs say about public schools. The truth is actually that our scores on the National Assessment of Education Progress, the NAEP, are at an all-time high, and dropout rates are at an all-time low. Graduation rates are at an all-time high. But the dilemma is this. If you're a public school person, you can never be satisfied unless you have 100% proficiency, because our job is all kids, not some kids. So even when you see this data going up in terms of NAEP scores, graduation rates, and dropout rates, we cannot be satisfied unless we have 100% proficiency. So the real question becomes, how do we achieve it? And the big distraction has been what's happened in this country in terms of so-called reform. It is a little embarrassing that we have to look to the countries outside of the United States, which I don't know if you've had Pasi Solberg here, but he would tell you that he actually learned, this is the former Finnish education minister, he'd tell you he'd actually learned from American schools and American educators how to put together the Finnish education system, which today is the top in the world. But what do they do? Singapore, China, Japan, Korea, Canada, Finland, what do they do? It's not rocket science. They emphasize high-quality teacher preparation and development. They emphasize collaboration, working together, problem solving, not killing each other. They align academic standards and instruction. They focus on equity. They provide a more equitable education for all students and offset the effects of poverty through wraparound programs and services. They emphasize teaching and learning and not testing. And the countries that have the strongest student performance also have some of the strongest teacher unions. And by the way, the highest achieving states in the United States are also the most densely unionized. So, why do I look at the international reforms? Because think about what's going on in America. We operate as if we are in an evidence-free zone. Take vouchers, for example. Decades of independent research show that vouchers, including America's longest-running voucher program in Milwaukee, do not improve outcomes for students who receive them, nor do they drive improvements in nearby schools. And countries that have enacted national voucher programs, such as Chile, have had similar results. In fact, Chile has become the most socially, economically segregated country in the world, in the OECD countries, regarding educational opportunities. Now, I'm not going to debate whether vouchers are a good idea or a bad idea. Lots of parents want them because they want their kids to be in safe schools. And lots of parents want them because they want their kids to have a real religious education. But the argument was that vouchers and competition would spur better public schools, and that somebody who went to a school with a voucher would have done better. And that is not the case, and that's also not the case about charters. Charter school performance is generally the same or worse than other public schools. Some of them are fantastic, including one that we created called Green Dot in New York City that has a 97% graduation rate. It's a school that I created in New York City with several other folks. But the issue is, do we actually have an opt-out system or an opt-in system? Do we actually try to figure out what actually will work based on the evidence to create equity, scalability, or sustainability, or do we still have this inane argument over ideology that's not based upon the evidence? And that gets to public and the issue about public education. Educating our nation's kids, I believe, only works when it's viewed and lived as a shared responsibility. Because when reforms are disconnected from the public system, as happens in vouchers or charter schools, or when parents lose control, like they do when their neighborhood schools are closed instead of fixed, or when public loses control, like when elected school boards are dismantled, then we lose the process of the public in public education. And what ends up happening is education becomes a commodity, not a community responsibility, and when that happens, we lose our democracy and with it, our economy. In my words, I would flip them. So the key is for us as a union, and I think for anyone who is involved in terms of education, is how do we turn this around? How do we make this country and our schools not about testing, but about teaching? Not about a fixation on testing and the test score, but a fixation on teaching and learning. And lots of people are trying to do this around the country right now. And what the AFT has tried to do, and the Edwards School is an example of that, is we've tried to do three things. Number one is to really focus on what community believes. Not the corporate reformers, not the think tanks, not trying to find what the algorithm is, but real public education reform comes from the bottom up, with parents and communities working together to help all kids thrive. That's what we call community-driven reform, and that's what we say when we mean, or that's what we mean when we say, how do we make every single public school a school where parents want to send their kids, where teachers want to teach, and where students thrive? I know that's not data-based, but that's the way I look at schools all the time. And so what we've said is, let's not just call out what's wrong, but how do we do what's right? How do we actually solve problems, not just win arguments? And that's what we call at the AFT solution-driven reform. And how do we actually have our members be in the front, not only in the trenches, but in leadership positions to try and do some of these things? So we start with not what the Edwards School did, but with things like a high-quality early childhood program. High-quality early childhood. Now, if high-quality early childhood was a stock or commodity, investors would be racing for a piece of the action because every dollar that is spent on early childhood programs return up to $11 of economic benefits. There's no one who disputes the economic value of early childhood education. But this is the question. knowing what we know about that, knowing about the return on investment, why are we not providing every single four-year-old an early childhood education? And there's something else that we know, which is that communities don't want their schools closed. They want kids to go to school close to their homes. And what we've seen in places like Cincinnati and other places where we've been able to connect with community in this way, that if you wrap services around a school so that you're both mitigating poverty and doing education at the same time, kids' outcomes improve. Cincinnati, for example, has helped every public school become a community school, offering students and their families access to these wraparound services like health and mental health services, tutoring, counseling, after-school program. Student mobility, which can be really disruptive to a kid's education, is hugely down. Discipline referrals also down. Students are in school, they're learning, parents feel like their kids are safe. And Cincinnati is the only urban district in the entire state of Ohio that has made, for the last several years, annual yearly progress, even with all the cuts that happened economically and educationally. But it's not just what other things are in our quality agenda, not just early childhood education, not just the wraparound services. We also took a real hard look at ourselves. And that's why we proposed both what to do on preparation as well as what to do in teaching and learning. And those are the last three things I'll talk about, and then I'll stop. AFT is challenging the common rite of passage whereby newly minted teachers are tossed the keys to our classrooms, expected to figure things out, and left to see if they and their students can sink or swim. Now, there's lots of ed schools in this land that do an awfully good job and really try not to do this. But at least 1 out of 3 students who go to ed schools say that they're unprepared, and even more who go through alternative certification say that they are unprepared. It's really, really criminal that where Finland will prepare teachers like we prepare doctors, and we still believe in this kind of sink or swim mentality. And so what the AFT tried to do was to say, look, let's not add on to what happens with new teachers. Let's try to figure out what are the things that new teachers need to know and be able to do. And instead of having the current certification processes, let's have a different certification process, like a medical board or like a law-type board that is multidimensional, that is about skills we need, clinical experiences we need, so that when we walk into a classroom for the first time, we feel competent and confident. And then what will ultimately happen is that the schools of education that do well and that really prepare kids well, or new teachers well, we're going to see that. And instead of pretending that it's okay to have no experience and no education to be a new teacher, we'll start actually owning our own profession. And that's what the bar exam proposal was about, and that's why I was so grateful that Dr. Hargrave's students helped us figure out some of the nuances with it. But it's not simply about preparation, as important as that is. It's also when we get into classrooms. And you've seen too often this discussion about evaluation and about bad teachers. And at the end of the day, we need to make sure that all teachers know what they're doing, know how to do it, and also look ourselves straight in the eyes and say, if someone can't, they shouldn't be in teaching. That fairness is really important, but quality is as important as fairness. And that's why we actually took on evaluation even before we took on some instruction methodologies. And we developed a model to overhaul teacher development and evaluation by not jettisoning tenure or due process, something that we believe is really important to spur creativity and risk-taking, particularly when everything is changing, but to align due process with tenure and to align it with quality. So tenure would be about fairness, not an excuse for employers not to manage, and not a way to cloak incompetence. And so what we've tried to do is say evaluations should not be momentary snapshots, but they should be meaningful systems of feedback and growth. Now, a lot of it has gotten perverted, but I believe that evaluations should address the following 4 questions. Do we have the tools to teach? Meaning, if I'm a school teacher and I have a class of 60 kids, is that really a tool for me to teach? Am I really going to be able to differentiate instruction to the needs of all of my 60 youngsters? I don't care how good I am. Do we have the tools to teach? Did we actually teach materials? Did we actually teach it? That's something that can be figured out. Question 3, did students actually learn it? Us teaching and kids learning may be 2 different things. And one of the things I saw at the Edwards School, which was so powerful, was that if you use data in an immediate feedback way. So say you gave a math test yesterday or 2 days ago, and you saw that 3/4 of your kids didn't get fractions. And you thought the lesson was fantastic. There's a big difference between did I teach it and did kids learn it. And if you figure that out right then and there, you can go back and back and back. And that's why data is important. Not as an assessment of you later on, but immediately to figure out what's going on. And then the 4th question is that if we fall short, even after receiving help, if we clearly haven't been able to teach it and kids are not learning it, then is there a fair process to usher us out of the profession? 4 questions. That's what evaluation should be about. And our curriculum should be rich and robust. And what AFT has tried to do is to basically say, let's really have a Common Core. Let's really have a curriculum and standards that are aligned to what kids need to know and be able to do in the 21st century. And we've created this big website and platform so that people can share with each other some of that curriculum material, even though we know very well that that's not enough in order to change to this new Common Core. Now, why do I go through what we've done? Because at the end of the day, this is not rocket science, but it is about how do we make sure teachers are doing the best they can and get the professional development and the preparation and the ongoing work that they need? How do we have collaborative environments where people are working together? How do we have robust curriculum and the wraparound services that kids need so we can mitigate poverty? And the schools in this country and in other countries that do those 4 things, invest in teachers, invest in curriculum, have a real collaborative environment, and have those kind of wraparound services, those schools are really working, and those districts are really working. And the public has confidence in public education. And we are doing what we need to do to make a better world and to create a vibrant society and to enable opportunity for the next generation. And so what I'm asking you on your 150th anniversary, as we have, frankly, another anniversary at the same time, the March on Washington for jobs and freedom was about 50 years ago as well. This is what I'm asking you. You will be the leaders of the future. You will be the ones who not only make decisions about what you're going to do in your own life, but what this country will look like. Do you want a country that has greater inequality or greater equality? Do you want a country that actually, where people can actually endeavor to find opportunity, but have a fair playing field? Do you want a country where all kids, not just some kids, have opportunity? Those are the questions that will be before you, that you will be answering. And I'm asking you to think about strong labor unions and good public schools as drivers that enable opportunity, so that once again, this country can be one that enables the American dream. And on this 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, and on the 150th anniversary of Boston College, we think about what Martin Luther King said, which was, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Together, I believe, and it's in your hands, we can make the world and our country a more just and a more democratic place. Thank you.
You say you're doing what you can to make a better world, but you've been quite outspoken recently in opposing the academic boycott of Israel. But your union, for some reason, invests in Israel bonds. So I'm wondering why, if you want to see greater fairness and equity for people, that you're not opposing the apartheid and divestment movement against Israel that could result in some greater equity and fairness in the world.
Well, I actually am a big believer in Israel, and I am a big believer in the two-state solution. And I don't believe that the sanctions and disinvestment movement will do more than what the progressives in Israel right now are trying to do. I do think that there are things that the Israeli government has done that's wrong, and we fight against that. But at the end of the day, what you have in the Middle East is you actually have one democracy that does some really bad things. But there's no other democracy in the Middle East other than Israel. And so to compare Israel to where South Africa was, which is when the divestment movement started, I think is wrong. At the same time, I think everybody has their right to say whatever they should say or want to say, and that's why we were very supportive of Brooklyn College having whatever forums they want to have, freedom of association, freedom of thought. The First Amendment is a vital piece of our democracy. But I do think that there are different views about what's happening in Israel and how to get to a peace process.
Could you stand and identify yourself, please?
My name is Yoon Kim. I'm from Korea. I'm very interested in your suggestion, teacher by examination launching in USA. Do you believe by examination for teachers can work for highly qualified teaching make in USA? For example, my country right now is very positive, but still we are debating about that. Thank you.
So, we could do a lot more to learn from what happens in Korea, and in Singapore, and in China, and in Japan, on the issue of respect for teachers. Teaching is a high-status profession in all of those countries. Parents and the powers that be really have internalized that it is through education that kids will have opportunity. And, we are schizophrenic in America because we actually believe that our teachers are absolutely important, key to the kids' success, but then we demonize them and treat them like they are infants and don't give them the latitude that they need to actually teach. And you see much more of an alignment in Korea and in Japan and in China, or at least I've seen it in the times that I've been there, and in Singapore. Having said that, what we're also hearing from our Korean colleagues is that there's too much pressure on kids, and that things such as recess and art, music, and really kind of engaging with each other in a more creative pursuit is the struggle that's starting to go on in Korean schools. Did I get that right or no?
Hi, my name's Brad. I think that one of the biggest problems, or at least perceived problems, that people associate with teacher unions is a sort of work-to-rule mentality, where teachers are doing the bare minimum. And I'm wondering what you think about that in terms of what is the extent of that problem, what are the causes of it, and what would you suggest the union can do to transcend, eliminate, somehow solve that problematic approach to teaching?
So I think there's there's two answers to that question. One is, if you look at most teacher contracts, they're actually not teacher union contracts, because all these contracts have been bilaterally done between some management group, whether it's a school board or a mayor or whatever, as well as the teachers union. And I often, I find it remarkable when we end up getting more credit or become the straw man, as if every single ridiculous thing in a contract was something that came from Tom Gosnell, Richard Stutman, or my head. And there are lots of things in contracts that should be revisited. But the key here is that contracts were started in education, in an industrial model, not in a professional model. And that's what you're focused on. The fact that schools are essentially organized, like take a high school. High schools are essentially organized as factories. X number of minutes per period, then people move to the next period, and then they move to the next period. So the contracts were actually aligned to that kind of factory model, as opposed to a knowledge model. Believe it or not, contracts in the trades are much more based upon a knowledge and a craft model than contracts in public education. And so what happens is that when somebody says, oh, well, I just want to actually follow my contract in the public sector, if a CEO said that, no one would say that's a bad thing. But when a teacher says that, somebody says, well, is there a difference between what your contract says and doing the best job you can for kids? And that's the kind of dilemma that you are raising. So what I'm talking about is, how do we actually align contracts to to ensuring that they are more what parents need and teachers need in order to do a great job with kids. How do we do that? And that's the kind of stuff that you see in the Edward School, and that's the kind of stuff you see in the Green Dot School that we did in New York. And when you start seeing schools where people are really working together collaboratively, that they are actually changing terms and conditions in a school to be aligned to what they believe their kids need for the next year, then no one asks the question about work to rule anymore. They actually run to the contract to say, what does it say? The one issue that is a rub, though, is this. What happens when there's fundamental unfairness? Like, what happens when you actually negotiate one of those things, and then there's a new principal that comes in and says, oh, no, I really, really need you to stay till 8 or 9 or 10 o'clock every night just because I need it. And you have a family, and you have 2 young kids, and you say, no, I can't really do that. I'll work at home, but I can't really do that. And that's when you have that kind of really nasty relationship, that's when people start looking at their contract. The moment that you have a question about somebody working to rule or looking at their contract and it's not like a contract negotiation situation, you know that what you really have is just a bad relationship problem. But what we're trying to do is find different ways that you use contractual relationships and contractual language to actually turn this around, to focus on a quality agenda.
Hi, I'll turn like this. So I heard you talk about high quality early childhood education, and this has been a major topic, I think, right now in the national and in the state rhetoric. But preschool teachers right now are not unionized, and I'm curious, I guess, I think there's a tremendous potential, as you mentioned, to having early education for all if we get there. But I see a hazard too in that sort of all of the issues you bring up about teacher quality, teacher professionalism are, I think, epitomized in the preschool teaching profession because it's such even more varied, and so I think that there are probably 1,000 different definitions of what high quality could mean. So I guess I'm just curious to hear more of your thoughts about what is happening in your union right now, thinking about that being a potential expansion of the public education system, and how you address that high quality issue for children and for teachers.
You have to actually do both quality, and the debate nationally is custodial care versus quality. And the way in which it's normally talked about is quantity versus quality. I hate actually talking about kids that way, though. But it's how many, if you only have $100 for a slot, or you only have $100, don't you want to make sure that you have enough custodial care for kids that really need it? And I think what the president tried to do this last week in the State of the Union is to say, let's find a way to work with states, knowing that what we know about early preparation and how it gives kids a leg up going into school. Let's find a way to actually have high-quality slots for every 4-year-old. We can size this problem, we can figure out what it costs, and let's do that. And part of the proposal was to not actually race to the bottom, but to have teachers who are, whether they're in public schools or whether they're in charter schools or whether it's done through not-for-profits, but to have people who are credentialed enough so that they actually have the content knowledge and the pedagogy. So the proposal was actually a hybrid of both. It didn't say that all of this has to be done in a public school system. It said that it could be done in Head Start, it could be done by not-for-profits, it could be done by charter schools, but that there would have to be attention to both the preparation and the credentialing of teachers, as well as the other emoluments that kids need in pre-K. So the real question becomes, will the states buy in? Because there's not, the X millions of dollars now that we're in the middle of sequester, and we're actually about to lose 70,000 Head Start slots for children right now as of March 1st because of the automatic cuts. The real question becomes, is there the wherewithal and the commitment of states, knowing full well what the evidence is, to be a partner with the federal government to make sure that 4-year-olds, particularly in high poverty areas, get the services they need?
Hi, my name is Francis. I originally came to this event because I saw democracy in the title, and I thought, yes, BC is emphasizing democratic equality. But now that I've seen that it's been basically a union stump speech, I have a number of questions that I would like to ask you. The first one is, why in the districts that overrode Scott Walker's reforms were the ones that had to lay off teachers? The other one being, you asked earlier what the image that we have of unions. Why is it that my image of a union is of teachers getting doctor's slips and then deciding to stampede and invade the Madison State Capitol, or marching in the streets of Chicago, or people wearing SEIU shirts, roughing up me and my friends and verbally assaulting us for holding Mitt Romney, Scott Brown, and Charlie Baker signs? My real question for you today, though, is this. If unions are so great and everyone wants to become part of them, why mandatory dues? Why not give me the opportunity to, instead of just having my $26.95 per paycheck go directly to the union, give me the opportunity to write out the check instead and give me the chance to say, hey, you know what, I don't like what my union's doing, or I don't like how much money my union is donating to Democrats, I'm not going to pay my union dues this month.
So which of those questions would you like me to answer? So number one, in Chicago, where, first off, I am sorry that people roughed you up in terms of your fighting for Mitt Romney, but I would fight as hard for your right to fight for Mitt Romney as for my right to support Barack Obama. That's what democracy should be. That is what we all should be, just like I said to the gentleman over there, that even if I disagreed with my colleagues who were very much supporting the divestment movement in the boycott and sanction divestment movement in Israel, part of what we must do is fight for everyone's rights to have the right of free association and the right of free speech, and to do it in an encumbered and unequivocal way. So that's number one. Number two, the issue about dues is that in the law of this land, our members should have a right not to be involved in any of our political work. And they have a right not to be involved in political work. And in fact, in most of our unions, what happens is that the work we do politically, if somebody objects, they get a check back. But the real issue is that if we are, it's kind of like, an opt-out. If we are actually doing everything we can to represent everybody who is part of the bargaining unit, say there's 100 people that are part of the bargaining unit, and say one person had a real medical emergency, and we had to take an arbitration for that person. And all of a sudden, this year in our dues, that medical arbitration that we had to have for that person, because that person had cancer and went through their sick days, and the principal said, sorry, I'm firing you. And we said, no, that's not fair. And the principal fired the person. And we took it to either court or to arbitration or something like that. And all of a sudden, that year, we had more expenses than the dues that came in, or as many expenses as the dues, and went to the members and said, okay, we need a dues increase the next year because of what just happened. There might be somebody who says, wait a second, that wasn't my arbitration. That was Stutman's arbitration. I wasn't the one with cancer. Stutman was the one with an issue. So why do I have to pay a dues increase? Or why do I have to pay those dues? And that's essentially what the problem here is. That if we don't actually, for everything that we represent, if everybody who's represented by us doesn't actually just pay a fair freight, then we're not going to be able to do the representation. Not for politics. People have a right not to be engaged in politics. But in terms of the day-to-day work that we've done. And so what the Republican governors have done is they've said, I'm not going to give you a wage increase. You pay dues to your union. And when people are really, 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 really stretched, they're saying, oh, I really need more money in my paycheck, so I don't have to pay my union dues. And that has happened in a couple of places, and then in a few places it hasn't happened. But that's why we have said that if we represent you, we need something for that representation because it doesn't come for free.
Hi, my name's Kevin. My question is, you brought up the factors of innovation and your passion for entrepreneurship and that whole idea, and it's something I'm very passionate about too. And what I see with a lot of the factors that go into what make a great startup is the fact that people have to invest an enormous amount for an enormous risk, and the quality of the product ends up being tremendous. And a lot of 90% of the startups end up failing. That kind of segues into my other question is, how do you balance the factors of quality and fairness with making sure that you're protecting, obviously, the teachers' jobs who are in the union, while also assuring that the high quality of their product is maintained? Because I know that one of the main issues, one of the main criticisms includes the fact that teachers are reaching who have failed to do their job and have kind of designated as lemons and are passed around oftentimes. They reach a safety net that protects them from that. And I know startups fail when they do that.
Right.
And companies create poor products and they don't work out. And I was curious, how does the union assure that that safety net doesn't protect too many and that the quality of the education, the quality of the experience of the teacher, and the good teachers are protected and that the bad teachers aren't being held up and maintained in institutions?
So how many bad teachers do you think there are? Just a guess.
I couldn't put a number out there, but I'd say every school has its. I wouldn't say every school. It depends on the district, but some schools have more bad teachers than others. But I know they're out there. So
if there was a way through a fair evaluation system, that if you were confident that somebody who couldn't do his or her job over a year or two, through a fair evaluation system would actually be out, would you have the same question?
No, not if it worked.
Right. So the focus that we have done is this. I think we spent too much time focusing on fairness and not enough on quality. And would often say, remember what I said earlier, that tenure has to be, can't be an excuse for managers not to manage or a cloak of incompetence. But fairness is actually really important in terms of our work. And so what has happened over the years is that fairness became dominant because we would all tell the war stories, just like that young man told the war stories about he was in Madison and something happened in some district that actually laid off teachers after Scott Walker's, cuts. So there was one, so that one becomes his worldview. A lot of school teachers' worldview is that somebody was really unfair to me. The boss was really unfair to me. Came into my room, said really, didn't help me, just said, you know, there's a piece of paper on the floor, I'm giving you an unsatisfactory evaluation. Or in my case, I was a lawyer before I was a teacher. And I had a class where I had a mock trial. And my kids were really engaged and really loud. And if you were walking in the hall, you might have thought my class was total and complete mayhem. But if you were actually in the class, you would have seen kids incredibly engaged in this mock trial. But my vice principal said you didn't have good enough classroom management that day and actually gave me an unsatisfactory for the lesson. And those kind of stories are rampant. And so what the union would do is say, wait a second, we have to protect against fairness at all costs. What we're saying now is, no, that's not true. We have to protect against fairness, but we also have to make sure that there's quality. And that's why the first thing we did was to really start thinking about what would a fair evaluation system be, so that no longer, even in districts that don't have contracts, you wouldn't have people who, you know, it's hard to fire somebody. It's really hard. Anybody in this room have ever fired someone? That whole table. Easy or hard? It's hard. So it's not a surprise that a principal would say, I can't fire that person, the union contract stops me. So we said, okay, let's pierce through this. Let's have a real evaluation system based upon performance, where it's based upon those 4 questions. Do I have the tools? Did I teach it? Did kids learn it? And if that didn't happen and I've had some help, meaning if I got the tools, but I couldn't teach it, kids didn't learn it, I got some help, I should be bye-bye. And that's what we're trying to get implemented in districts. Because the reason that this is different than a startup or than a traditional entrepreneurial exercise is that our obligation is for every single child in our classroom. And in a public school situation, unlike in a private school situation, public schools should not and don't have the authority. Remember I said should not and don't have the authority to say, I want this child, I don't want this child. We should be like the Statue of Liberty. We take all comers and we take all kids in our embrace. And whereas I may, as a school teacher, be really effective with one group of kids in my classroom because the classroom, the alchemy, it all works, the next year I may be totally ineffective. Because a lot of this is not simply based upon your skills as a teacher, your love as a teacher, your caring as a teacher, but it's also based upon the alchemy of all those children that are with you and how they work with each other. So that's why this whole notion of bad teachers, bad teachers, bad teachers, a lot of this was, it was really, people never actually spent the time trying to figure out how to constantly improve instruction, and instead, what got defaulted was, oh, it's the union's fault, it's management's fault. At the very same time that we no longer can just do memorization, 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 we have to actually help all kids have the skills so they can be the entrepreneurs that you're talking about.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one last short question, promised to be short. Immediately following this answer, we have a lovely reception, food over here, drinks here. Those doors are going to open. There's more food and drinks inside. So we're going to keep this short.
Sure, okay. Anyway, my name is Maureen, and my brother actually invited me here. He's the BC grad, not me. But I had this very elaborate question that was prepared about like a kind of social democracy and socialist movements in a lot of the teachers' unions now, just because I tend to be a little bit on the other side of some of the other things being discussed. But I guess other than that, I just wanted to say that I used to be a New York City school teacher when a lot of these alternative certification things were going on. I was in Teach for America, had no idea what I was doing, and as much as I've been a little bit skeptical of a lot of your work, along with some other teaching fellows, I just wanted to thank you for saving my job.
That sounds to me like a very good ending. Please join me in thanking Randi Weingarten.